Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Juliet Foster, and welcome to Ensuring Access for Remote and Rural Communities. Now, what we've done is that we've broken this discussion down into two themed sessions, both of which will have a panel of experts. So let me introduce you to the panel. This gentleman here is Timothy Reuter. Timothy is Head of Drones and Tomorrow's Airspace at the Centre for the Fourth Industrial Revolution at the World Economic Forum. Welcome. This gentleman here is Yohei Fujikaki, who is a Senior Service Designer, Next Generation Mobility Team Management Strategy Department at Adaptation Electric Railway Company. Is that the correct pronunciation? Excellent, excellent. Eleanor Lacroix is Director, Department for General Studies, Development and Territories at RATP France. Welcome. Gloria Hutt is the Minister for Transport and Telecommunications for Chile. Welcome. Ofelia Betancourt is Professor of Applied Economics, University of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria, Spain. Welcome. And Helen Hughes is Director, Professional Services, Transport Infrastructure, Ireland. Welcome. Now, each expert will give a brief introductory statement, after which they will be interviewed by me. I say interviewed. This is really informal. It's a conversation. Afterwards, we're going to open up the floor to you guys. So that means you'll have the opportunity to join us in this conversation in a reserved seat, especially for you. So please don't be shy. So any questions or points that you wish to raise with these guys, go ahead and do it. Also, before we begin, this panel is going to serve as an input to a high-level ITTF roundtable on connectivity for small populations in remote communities. And that's going to be hosted by Transport Canada in Ottawa from the 23rd to the 24th of September. So it's one to keep in the diary. So let's begin with the first of our themed discussions: transport policies and planning, meeting essential needs of remote and rural communities. I'd like to invite Gloria Hutt, Helen Hughes and Ofelia Betancourt to my circle. Please take your places. Okay. We're going to start with some introductions, and the floor, Gloria Hutt, is now yours.
Thank you. The first thing regarding isolated areas...
you have a microphone.
The first thing is to ask why we have population living in very remote areas. And we can identify basically three reasons. One is geopolitical. We have to cover the territory. There is other, which is the freedom of people to live wherever they want. And there is also, in the case, for example, of rural communities in Latin America, a strong link with the land and with their animals, for example. And sometimes there are very critical situations, and those communities do not want to move to other places because of the link with the land. Then how we can mitigate that isolation? First, through digital connectivity is one of the options. And if we can connect those communities, they have access at least to a better level of education and culture. The second is subsidizing transport. And we do that in Chile. We allocate lots of money every year to provide with ferries, for example, in the islands in the south with an average occupation rate of 2 or 3 people at a very high cost to reach the islands. And it's a policy because there is the right of that community to live there. And the third is to adapt the methodologies, because if we use the existing methodologies to evaluate projects, for example, to estimate social profitability, given the volume, you will never, with those methodologies, you will never reach profitability index that make eligible the allocation of funds. So funds must be allocated under different criteria. Key issues to discuss. There are some projects to move people to more dense areas in the surrounding. So make it more efficient in order to provide them with better quality services based on a more concentrated population or higher volume. It's difficult to move them, but probably when it is efficient to install a center that can give them services. And some structural changes could be analyzed, because in those communities we could think out of the box, and probably the way we operate in schools could be different, and we can deliver classes in a different way. So I think the situation of those isolated communities and rural areas with a very small number of inhabitants could be approached in a more creative way, with more participation of the community itself. They are people that they are very autonomous, so they are able to resolve many of the problems. So we could transfer some of the activities that are provided by the public sector in cities to some local communities. So I think there are interesting challenges on how we can strengthen the options for them in terms of avoiding that living in those areas means a big gap of opportunities for this population.
Thank you very much. Helen Hughes.
Thanks, Juliet. So Ireland is a bit different than Chile, but we have 37% of the population live in rural areas. And at the moment we have a plan called Project 2040, which is a national spatial strategy. And we have determined different objectives. So we have objectives for strengthening rural economies and communities, and also ensuring regional connectivity. And the organisation that I work for is Transport Infrastructure Ireland, which performs the role of National Road Authority. So we look after a network of about 5,600 kilometres of roads, half of which is a national secondary network, which is providing access to these rural areas. So we're supporting, because we have this government policy now, we have to say, well, what's going to be the supporting policy framework, and what evidence are we going to use to prioritise investment in these areas? So we've actually found that we have developed a transport model many years ago, and we're finding it to be more and more useful. And we've actually defined, well, first thing we want to do is define, well, what is remote? How can we do it? So we've used the model to, and then what do people need? What services? So we're looking at maintaining essential services to these areas. And obviously people need to be able to access medical, all sorts of services. And we have 43 towns in Ireland of a population of 10,000, and all those services are available. So we've graded the different areas within 15, half an hour, 45 minutes, and an hour from these towns where they're going to get the services. And actually 95% of the rural population is within an hour of one of these towns. So if we can look at any transport interventions that will improve that journey time, can be appraised and evaluated. But another area is very much the whole area of options. You need options to access an area, and if you've only one option, one transport network, and we're talking about a country where the rail network is only between the major cities, so the railway network is not an option here. It's 90% private car access. So if you need to maintain access, so you want the first priority is availability. You need a network, you need a road. So we've actually looked at this concept, and it's been used in Scotland as well, the concept of Lifeline Roads, which roads that if they were cut off would be so disruptive for that whole area. And that is actually, we've identified that using the transport model, and that is going to inform how we spend money in our maintenance regime and make sure that there's no risk of closure of these roads. So there are two aspects of using modelling that were used, and that will inform appraisal, because using, as Gloria said, using normal cost-benefit appraisal methods, you'll never have a good enough business case. So, thank you.
Okay, Ophelia, you do realise there is a microphone there, so
yeah.
we're not that stingy. You do have your own microphones.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to provide my view here today as a resident in a remote area, actually an outermost area in Europe. I live in the Canary Islands. This is a small archipelago located by the Morocco coast, very near of Africa. But I would like also to provide my view as an economist, able to assess the policies that are being applied at the moment to promote air transport connectivity over there. Well, the Canary Islands is, as I said, the Spanish archipelago, close to Africa. And we have a special case, I think, over there, because we have the distance, we comply with the distance criteria. We are 2,000 kilometers from the capital of Spain, Madrid. But we have also not exactly low density. We have important high density routes as well as low density routes, and they are all of them are mixed somehow. We have a air transport level at the inter-islands level as well, and main connections with mainland Spain as well with the rest of Europe. I have to say that at the regional level, we have some routes over half a million passengers per year. They are very small routes, below 200 kilometers. This is a lot of traffic. And as well, in routes connecting with mainland Spain, we have more than 2 million passengers in some routes. So we are at the very top in some cases, but as well at the very low. So because we are 8 islands, some of them are large and with a lot of population, and some of them are small. Actually, the number of passengers that were processed through the 8 airports we have in the islands was 45 million last year. Okay? I would like also to mention that the population in the Canaries is 2 million, but we had almost 14 million tourists last year. So we have a bit of everything, but we're still remote. So the point here is just to realize that not all remote regions are the same. We might have different needs and we might require different policies. At the moment, regarding the air transport in the islands, and as well connected with mainland Spain and Europe, we have different interventions. First of all, we have public service obligation declarations. This is an exception within the European regulation. That means that within the single European market, the single European air transport markets, we have an exception. We have regulation. We have regulated markets over there. It's a bit weird because we have very large traffic in some of the routes and others are very low. At the beginning, the public service obligations were declared for all the inter-island routes. We don't have public service obligations with mainland Spain. And as I said at the beginning, they were declared in 1998 without any compensation. So it was a bit strange because it was even compatible with competition, although the competition was marginal. Nowadays, there are some routes that are being operated under compensation. So this is on the one hand, PSO declarations on inter-island routes. On the other hand, in second place, we have subsidies for resident passengers. So the aim is to protect the passengers and ensure that they can fly. And this subsidy takes the form of an ad valorem subsidy applicable to all resident passengers living in the Canaries as well. This is a similar regulation for those living in the Balearic Islands and the cities in Ceuta, Melilla. And at the moment, we enjoy a 75% of discount of the flight fare. This discount has been evolving over the 30 years, the last 30 years, from 10% to the current 75%. Now we have two main concerns regarding this subsidy. The main concern is whether instead of protecting the passengers, is being obtained by the airline, because the airlines apparently they are raising the prices. This is the main concern. The second concern is whether non-resident passengers are being expelled from the market. And there has been a lot of complaints in this regard. Finally, we have also subsidies in order to promote new routes. in order to ensure or to facilitate the startup of new routes in order to continue attracting more tourism to the islands. Well, we have also a similar situation in maritime transport. Not exactly the same, but very similar. So the main idea is not that not all remote regions have the same problems, and policies should be smart and specific in this regard. And although I agree in part with this social evaluation of projects affecting remote communities, I think social evaluation is about efficiency, that's true. And we need to combine this social evaluation efficiency criteria with probably equity criteria. And I think equity criteria, we need to combine both in order to make choices in this context.
Great, and it's hard making these decisions as well, because what I've learned is that it's very difficult to define what a remote and isolated community is, and that's half the problem, because you're talking about islands, and I think you said it's about 37 miles or something. 37%, I do beg your pardon. 37% of the population are defined as rural, but that might not necessarily tally with somebody else's experience.
Because some of those 37% are actually very well served because they're close to these towns. But it's only that minority that are really on the fringes that maybe you have to put in extra measures. You know, maybe you have to have services like mobile libraries or mobile doctors or things that, because there are a lot of old people living in these communities who don't have access to cars. Now there is rural transport schemes as well, which another agency delivers, and that transports. Public transport system that they use, they don't do scheduled services. The local community ring a line and say, we need a bus next week for this because a group of us are going shopping in Galway or somewhere. So that's another, that's other measures that you can actually focus on those very remote areas.
And this is the other thing which has come out, it's the fact that the strategies are changing all the time. What worked a couple of years ago might not necessarily work 2 or so years later.
Yeah, exactly. Because they evolve.
Microphone.
Sorry. They evolve. For example, there are very basic things that change the quality of life of those communities. When I refer to isolated and rural communities, I am speaking about people who live very high in the mountains and far away, and they do not have the possibility of approaching the next town. And we have subsidies for isolated zones, and sometimes it's just to put the service of a bus. It's quite difficult because are isolated zones, so you do not find many operators that are willing to provide the service, even under a subsidy. But once you find, just delivering 1 trip a day for that community to the closest town, there are life changes because, for example, they do knitting, and they say we cannot deliver if we do not know when we can give our products to the shop where tourists buy. But if we know that we can go every week, then we can develop. And you see how the community, the whole community evolves with a basic connection of 1 trip a day. Also for children that can go to the town, and they increase their social life. The possibility of moving from the place where they live does not exist for them. So it's something that is out of discussion. So mobile services like in the islands in the south, for example, we have is a kind of hospital ship from the Navy, and they go through the islands, and it's like the mobile doctor that visit the communities. That's what I mean when I suggest transferring or delivering the services from the public sector in a different way.
And let's just be a little bit controversial here, because when you look at these communities and the amount of investment that has to go into providing these services, it does beg the question, is it better to subsidise populations in isolated areas? And this is something which I'd like you all to address. Or is it better to perhaps promote densification in specific areas, in surrounding areas which are larger, and because of that, perhaps it may encourage people in remote areas to move in a bit closer.
That's the key question, and we had a discussion about 1 month ago with the Ministry of Social Development, and the conclusion was that it's theoretical, because even, for example, we had a big eruption of a volcano, and people in rural communities did not want to abandon because they have animals, and they live from their animals. So it's not just the optimization or the economic account of giving them more services. It's the type of life that they live that is different. So in those cases of a big isolation, the approach must be different than the conventional one.
Because this is happening, though this densification is happening anyway, without...
Can I interrupt for 1 moment? Can we just turn up your microphone slightly? Yep. Sorry about that, because I'm not sure that everybody could hear you very well, but do go on.
They can do it.
Great,
yeah.
go for it.
This depopulation is happening anyway, without any... It's just happening, so what we're trying to do is, I think very much the people living there are caretakers of the land, and also obviously there are a lot of them involved in agriculture, but there also is a huge tourism focus. We need to have good access for tourists. They need access to the markets. So I think for me, it's very much about environmental thing. I always see farmers as caring for the environment, looking after the countryside. So it's actually it would be more incentives to stay rather than to go into the urban areas. I think would be better.
And certainly when the demographics come into it, Ophelia, the key thing, you need to keep the younger people there for that continuity of ways of living.
Yes, but the people there have a good quality of life, but we don't have the opportunities. So the people want to stay there, but the good opportunities in labor markets are not there. So this is very important for the young people, and we actually have a very high unemployment rate of young people. In the last years, used to reach almost 50%. Now it's becoming lower. It's about 30, about 37 or something, which is still high. So we need to provide them some opportunities, and probably they are not still in the Canaries.
So for you, that's the challenge. How do you address it?
Maybe providing specific policy for them, subsidizing them if they want to study in other places or they want to reach other labor markets. But specific policies for the young, I think they are very important in this context.
But then what happens if it doesn't achieve the desired effect? Because if they're not going to stay, because they still want to move, then what happens next? You need to have that continuity.
In what sense?
If people don't want to stay, the young people, they don't want to stay, you're doing what you can.
Probably.
Yeah.
They would like to stay, but then they don't have many options.
Or they just may feel, well, look, let's just migrate, let's go somewhere else, let's just go somewhere. So what happens to these strategies to keep them there, to encourage them to stay?
Then we need to think about what else can we do in our labor markets, what can we do to promote jobs, to create jobs over there, but maybe this is not the case. And labor markets are changing everywhere. So at the moment, the situation is probably we need to encourage them, to be fair with them, to encourage them to move out. And then we will see whether we can do something else in the Canaries. But at the moment, I think the best opportunities are abroad. Otherwise, we wouldn't have such a high rate of unemployment.
But the key thing is to gauge how these initiatives are actually bridging the gap between remote areas and regions which are already well connected. So it's a slightly unfair question, but I'd like to start with you, Gloria. Do you feel that you're on track, that the strategy is hitting the targets, it's doing the right thing, going in the right direction?
I think that we are improving the connectivity, and that target is quite well achieved. So these communities, we have a very good coverage, and we allocate a significant amount of resources every year to finance rural and school buses in these isolated communities, which is very difficult to reach, but they can go to the school, so that allows them to stay there a little longer. However, the longer term is very difficult to improve, because once they are in the high school and they want to go to the university, for example, you have no means of having a university there, so they must go to the city. And that is a reality that is very difficult. It's not a matter of resources, it's a matter of other needs of the country. So we cannot install universities in each of these communities. So it's difficult how to approach that. And I think that providing them with capabilities to expand their activities, for example, rural tourism is a possibility. And in many of these communities, they receive tourists interested in precisely go to remote areas. And then we face the inconvenience that tourists pay with credit card. So you need electricity and you need an internet connection. And we are working on that way.
So it's expanding the internal infrastructure.
We are expanding optical fiber in every municipality in the country. So the last mile is subsidized as well to allow the mobile phone companies to install their facilities and to provide connection. If we do that, then we will open the possibility of them to have an activity, a commercial activity, for example, that is an opportunity for high school or young people with a possible activity. But education is I think is the problem not resolved.
And Helen, I could see you nodding vigorously there.
Well, just from my knowledge of these areas, most people don't have an employer. They're mostly self-employed, or they're part-time farmers doing something else. And so the whole area of digital connectivity is vital for them, because there's lots of enterprise and entrepreneurs that actually can use, once they're connected to the internet, there's no end to the possibilities. So it's not that big employers are going to locate themselves in these remote areas, but people are being very creative in thinking of, because they actually usually want to be there, want to stay there. And so people actually move in because they're tired of urban life, and they actually choose to move.
So they're going the other way.
So there's other migration is happening the other way. So just from, I think a lot of self-employment.
Just down to, sorry, please go on.
With initiatives. This is an example that is can sound a little funny, but reflects how it is necessary to inspire them on different activities. We had a railway line that was closed because had no passengers in the end. And in the middle of the line, there was a small town, and they are promoting the recovery of the railway. So I had a meeting with them because I did not understand. They have a very good road now, so they are connected. They are far away but connected. And they say, well, we used to produce marmalade, and we sold our marmalade to the passengers of the train. So we need the train to come back.
To get people buying marmalade.
Because we lived from that. And it made very clear to me that they need also support in analyzing alternatives, because they are not exposed to dynamic markets as we are in the city. They do not receive all the stimulus. They have hardly have television. They have a local radio. So I think one important element is also to help them to think on what to do. They perfectly could produce the marmalade, bring it to the big city as an organic product, for example, and that could change their reality.
But it's worth boarding the train just to get some marmalade.
Yeah. Well, I said with the subsidy we can pay all the jars of marmalade. It's less expensive than the train.
I'm sold. I'm sold. But I mean, I was fascinated as well by the point of connectivity, because I mean, you know that in the UK it's a huge issue, and there is the complaint that a lot of remote communities are actually behind on the connectivity game. Is the Irish Republic ahead of? Or
that's a very controversial topic at the moment. Yeah,
for obvious reasons.
No, but actually there has been a government decision, even if the business case doesn't stack up so much because of social equity, that they have decided to provide connectivity to all of these remote areas, even at a cost. But that's a political decision.
But taking the bigger picture into account in terms of the economics that it brings.
Yeah. Well, they just feel it like if you want to overcome social isolation, if you want to have people having access to job opportunities, digital connectivity is a must now. That's in the modern age.
Yeah, and I mean, you're shaking your head in agreement. I'd love to get your take on that, because also as well, in terms of initiatives bringing regions together, the PSOs, the public service obligations, they tick the right boxes. They've done it for you, haven't they?
I think the intentions were good, but they didn't understand correctly what was going on, what was going on in the market. Because putting such a regulation in routes with huge demand is unnecessary and probably is negative for the market. So mixing things and trying to protect, and in the end, reaching the opposite result is a risk, and we have that experience. On the other side, we have as well to recognize that we need to protect other people living in the smallest islands. But doing this for everybody is counterproductive. And so we need to provide, we need a deep analysis of the situation. And when you have a mixture result, you need to separate one cases from the others and provide, again, smart solutions and specific solutions for each case.
Which comes back to a point that I can't remember who raised it, in fact, but it was this idea of community involvement, stakeholder involvement, because clearly people know what works for them. So what I'm interested in finding out from the three of you is how you involve these communities.
Yeah, that's something that we can understand as social engineering, is how we redefine the delivery of services in a different way. They are very keen to collaborate. Since they are isolated, they have, in a very natural way, the willingness to collaborate and to improve the conditions of the community. So once you ask someone to take one of these roles, they do it very efficiently. We have some ferries that go to very isolated islands. And, for example, there is one person who lives in the island who keeps the keys of a container that is in the dock where the ferry arrives, and that function works very well. And you do not need someone from the Navy or the municipality. It's a person of the community. That kind of initiative, I think, could make them aware, give them more activity, and also organize the community based on functions and some kind of order.
Okay, community involvement.
Well, there's a lot of community groups, active community groups in Ireland, in the rural areas, but very much they're linking in with the local authority, you know, that they would work together in partnership with the local authority. But it's not a topic I know an awful lot about, the social engineering.
But certainly the principle, though, of actually, I think the underpin to this was, look, you need to work with the communities, because if you're going to get this money, they know how it should be spent, they know what works best, so you can't cut the voices out.
Yeah, like for rural transport, this whole thing of the no scheduled bus service, but they will ring up and say we need a bus at this time, like that it's a flexible situation. So that's communities asking for transport services. So that's a good model, I think.
For example, in the case of transport, when we defined the services in the beginning, we asked for buses, common buses. But once you go there and you see the roads, you need four-wheel drive vehicles. So that's why the analysis of each case and the work with communities is relevant, is key.
Community involvement and transparency.
Yes, I think this is vital. In the islands, probably this happens through the authority of the islands. We call them cabildos, and they are very active in this regard. So I think they are able to communicate exactly what their needs are.
Excellent. Okay, so we've now reached that point where we can open up the floor to you, the audience, and I do believe we have one person who's chomping at the bit. Who wants to get involved. Please take your seat. And if you could introduce yourself, please.
I'm not sure about chomping at the bit, but my name is Sandra Lafortune. I'm the Director General of International Relations and Trade Policy at Transport Canada. And I just wanted to share a bit of Canada's perspective on dealing with rural and remote communities, because when it comes to connecting rural and remote communities, Canada has a small population and a large geography. So we have a big challenge in that area. So a few things that have happened recently. Earlier this year, the Government of Canada actually created a Minister of Rural Economic Development. And that person's mandate is to develop a strategy to strengthen transportation and broadband, and clean energy connections to rural communities in support of economic growth. And that's across the country, and it's one of these sort of horizontal mandates that works with all the other, they sort of don't have their own little spot, but they take a bit of everything from all the other departments that deal with rural and remote communities as well. But when talking about remote, there are no greater challenges for us than in the north. North of 60, we have 3 northern territories. They cover 3.5 million square kilometers, and their population is about 3 people per 100 square kilometer. So together, the territories have 57 municipalities to serve, with populations that range from just over 100 to 25,000. So these are not big places. And these communities rely on these transportation connections for their health, for their well-being, for economic opportunities, for education, for everything. In the Arctic and subarctic climates in these regions, continuous permafrost has historically made the construction of and maintenance of transportation infrastructure very difficult, and environmental changes are even making it worse because older and more established solutions like ice roads that have long enabled winter community travel and resupply are facing serious challenges from rising global temperatures. So in a lot of places, air travel is the only year-round transportation option for many communities, which makes them kind of vulnerable to airline schedules and route changes and the cost. So there have been strategic investments and policy changes that the national government has made, always with input from local and regional partners, to improve remote transport connectivity in Canada, increase the reliability and resilience of infrastructure, and open up economic opportunities. So there are a few infrastructure investment schemes that have recently been put into place in Canada over the last few years. There's one called the Investing in Canada Plan, which is a $180 billion plan over 12 years. And one of the 5 priority themes for this plan is, in fact, rural and remote communities. In addition, in 2017, the government announced a $2 billion National Trade Corridors Fund to invest in transportation projects across the country, selected on a competitive merit basis to strengthen the efficiency and resilience of transportation infrastructure. And this fund has $400 million specifically allocated to address critical transportation needs in the north. So if you think about it, this represents 20% of the fund going to address the needs of 0.3% of the population, which is pretty unprecedented. To date, the fund overall has allocated $800 million to 39 projects across the country that represent $1.9 billion of total investment by both the public and private sectors. And 377 million of this went to 13 projects in remote and rural areas. We also have just closed a call for proposals under this fund for northern projects. And we've made a point of having different assessment criteria for this part of the fund, because if you're looking at trade and transportation and trying to, have a competitive merit-based process, there's almost nothing in the north that will ever win when you consider, going from Montreal to Toronto, or Toronto to Quebec City, or Vancouver to the Asia. So we changed it so that some of these investments can actually happen in the north, where there really is a dearth of infrastructure. And in March, the Government of Canada actually announced an additional $400 million for investments in the Arctic and northern regions. And the last point that I want to make is just that we're also making investments to improve the resilience and responsiveness of northern transportation systems to adapt to the impacts of climate change through an initiative called the Northern Transportation Adaptation Initiative that is supported by a network of multidisciplinary scientific experts, community partners with specialized local knowledge, and other collaborators with experience in social sciences and public policy in sectors closely related to transportation and natural resources. So this multi-sectoral approach is advancing productive dialogues, maximizing the impacts of research outcomes, and developing adaptation solutions that are well suited to the communities and to the asset owners. So as part of this, we're also working collaboratively with federal, industry, Indigenous, and territorial partners to develop a new Arctic transportation policy framework that will help to shape our efforts and investments in the North. So just wanted to share some of those things that I think are interesting.
Oh, we think they're interesting too. Would you like to respond to that? Ophelia, would you like to respond at all? Go ahead. We're all friends together. But, sorry.
I would like to make a comment because what you find when you allocate funds are these relationships like the one that you said. It's 0.5% of the, or 0.3% of the population, and you are allocating an enormous amount of funds. And that's unavoidable. In these cases, if you consider that people have the right to live wherever they want, and you have to cover all your territory, is the cost for the country. In our case, the country is smaller, but it's in the, I was calculating in the range of $200 million per year that are dedicated only to these rural services of transportation, and also ferries in the south that is full of islands, and people have no other possibility. So the recognition that in those cases funds must be allocated in a more arbitrary way, it's very important as well, and not trying to force methodologies unless we discover a specific methodology to assess the convenience of allocating these funds.
And what is the public opinion about this ratio of funding going to that small population?
Actually, we haven't had any blowback about it because the North, there's a lot of mining that is starting to go on in the North, and actually infrastructure projects in the North, particularly mining, are kind of considered to be like a lot of the mining companies, in fact, pay for their own infrastructure, because a lot of these mining projects in the North are actually infrastructure projects with a hole in the ground at the end of it. So it's not like you can just dig a hole, and then when you pull out the ore or the mineral or the gem or whatever it is out of the ground, well, you put it on a truck, and then the truck takes it to the train, and then the train takes it to the port, and then the ship goes away. There is no truck, there is no road, there is no train, there is no port. We're talking about the high Arctic. So the other thing that's, that I think feeds into that is that the federal government does not pay for 100% of any of the projects. There has to be, there's always a private sector or another level of government as a partner. So there has to be support from the community and from the sort of next level of government for it to happen in the first place, because we aren't just going in and deciding, oh, this needs to happen here. It has to be done in partnership. Most of the time, it's the federal government will only put in 50%. In the territories, because they have a lot lower fiscal capacity, it can be up to 75%, but we will not pay for like 100% of the shot at all.
Okay, is there anybody else who would like to join us in the circle? Please come and join us. Yeah, please just sit down and introduce yourself, the organisation you represent.
Hello, I'm Betzner, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology.
Please take a seat.
Thank you. Zurich, Switzerland. I found the point of view from Canada very interesting, and I think it's a great means of also on a symbolic level to provide funds for regional, what in French we call désenclavement, which is the providing accessibility on a larger scale. Now, I'm always very happy, as a person who travels a lot and tries to avoid flying over land for obvious reasons, when I travel in Canada on the Via Rail service to see the little sticker on the cars that says this transport service is subsidized by the government of Canada, which is a first step to providing this inclusive transport. Now, to my best knowledge, in fall of last year, Greyhound Canada ended all passenger service in the western provinces, and what they claim to do after years of trying to get more subsidies or get a different level of subsidies. And still what they want to do, Greyhound, apparently they want to continue the freight service that they provide, meaning parcels that previously, or small boxes that were carried on the buses now are carried by trucks probably on the road because it's profitable, and the passenger service apparently is not. If not, they wouldn't have discontinued the service. So can this kind of thing, which I found to be, even as an external traveler, I'm attending a transport regulators conference in September and needed to buy a transportation from Vancouver into Calgary, and found that Air Canada sort of abused of the situation and WestJet and charged outrageous prices for whatever air ticket I wanted to buy 2 months ago for September. So obviously, as you said, you're putting people then at the mercy of the air transport, which can't be the ultimate solution. Do you think that this fund will help address that in the future, or kind of provide a more sustainable base for that?
Well, first of all, I have to tell you that flying within Canada is actually pretty expensive, because we just do not have the critical mass of people that you all have in England or in the EU, or, and, you know, we have 35 million people over an extraordinarily large landmass. So I'm not sure that you were necessarily being gouged. It could just be really expensive based on what you're considering. But in terms of Greyhound, well, two things. One is, yes, you're right, that was a situation, and the federal government has in fact stepped in to help other smaller bus providers, bus companies, to step into that space so that there is no place that will be completely cut off from other options. If they have no other options, then the federal government is helping other bus suppliers to work. So it's not like anybody's going to be stuck in their little spot and they can never get anywhere other than by car. In terms of the National Trade Corridors Fund, it would not, it's not for moving stock. So it's not, you can't buy more buses. It's sort of the bricks and mortar, or the studies that go into helping establish the bricks and mortar, or the environmental assessments or things like that. So this particular fund, no, but there are other programs within the Government of Canada that ensure that no one is completely out in the cold with no other way of getting around.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would anyone like to put some further questions to the panel before I wrap this session? No? Sorry, I'm half blind. Please come forward. I think you were hidden behind Helen, so I didn't see you. If you could introduce yourself and the organisation.
Hidden and remote.
Thank you.
Hi, Tom Cohn from UCL in London. So I want to be provocative and suggest that what we're doing here is pursuing a rights-based discussion of the issue. People have the right to go and live wherever they wish, and then we have a duty to respond to their right to be able to get to wherever they want to go. And I think that that is what causes the trouble for those who have to deliver transport, because if people live arbitrarily far from a centre, it doesn't follow, in my book, that they should expect to be able to get to a doctor as quickly as someone who lives in the centre of a city. So maybe we should get a bit more realistic and say, if you happen to choose, or maybe through happenstance live 1,000 kilometres from a city, then maybe we just have to take that into account in setting whatever parameters we set as regards what should be expected of your accessibility. Sorry, you live a long way from the doctor, it's going to take you a while. We'll facilitate it, but it's going to take a while.
That is provocative, isn't it? So, well, ladies, choose amongst yourselves who's going to take that on.
Please. You can't really overcome geography. You know, like the distance, the time, they accept that time. So if you think about transport poverty, you think of the time it takes, the availability of the service, the accessibility, and time will always be a factor. So we're not going to be able to do measures that are going to reduce the time. But we are going to make sure that there is availability of options. But time will not. It's very hard to improve time.
The other thing is that, I'm sorry, not all these communities have chosen to move recently. Many of them come from native people who have lived for a very long time in those places. So you do not want to lose some cultural roots. That's why I say it's much more than optimizing a trip. It's not that question is the first one, because when you go to these communities, and the first thing that I think is, why are they living here? With all these...
don't say that, though.
Yeah. But could be even less expensive for any government to move that people, to buy a house, to provide all the services, than keeping them there. But not of them, it's more recent that are more communities going to these places, but they go to places that already existed. So there is a route that has to be respected as well. So it's not as easy as to optimize the resources.
Okay, and Ophelia. Yeah. Oh, come on, you've got to share.
So in the end, what you're saying is that instead, I was born in the Canaries, so I should better go to Madrid or to London and live there. Then I wonder if you can provide me with all the funds I need to do so. Because in the end, it's an equity issue, what we are discussing, whether we are entitled to some things or not. But let me remember that we have acknowledged this at the European level. And in the case of the Canaries, in the case of Madeira as well, and Azores, and other places belonging to the European Union, we have been acknowledged as outermost regions, and this is in the treaties. So this has been recognized. So this is the starting point. Otherwise, we start discussing about what is equity, what we find acceptable or not. And I don't find acceptable to go to live in Madrid, for example.
Okay.
Right to reply?
You do have a right to reply. Can we make it the last reply so that we can then start the second session?
Okay. I was obviously provocative and possibly didn't make myself very clear, so I apologise for that. I'm not suggesting you go and live in Madrid, though. It is a fantastic city. Do consider it. But the Canaries are also lovely, so I can understand your choice. All I'm trying to get at is that I think we tie ourselves in knots if we think, from the perspective of public authorities, that there's a necessity to provide a certain minimum level of accessibility, which will tend to be measured in terms of time getting to something. And the UK knows all about this because we made a mess of doing this some years ago. We need to be realistic about the true distance between where people are and where they want to get to, and we need to base our policies on those distances. And I think your point is absolutely right. we can't bring places closer together, so what we say about the level of connectivity we will provide needs to reflect this reality.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to our panel. Thank you so much. Okay. So let's move on now, because we were given there a definition of remote. It leads to the second discussion, exploring the perspective of transport operators and the role of innovative technologies in connecting remote and low-density areas. So let me introduce you to the panel. Eleanor Lacroix. She is Director, Department for General Studies, Development and Territories at RATP France. Yohi Fujikaki is Senior Service Designer, Next Generation Mobility Team Management Strategy Department, Odakyu Electric Railway Company. And Timothy Reuter. Tim or Timothy? Timothy. Timothy, okay, Timothy is your preference. Well, Timothy is Head of Drones and Tomorrow's Airspace at the Centre for the Fourth Industrial Revolution at the World Economic Forum. Eleanor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, when you think of remote communities, you shouldn't think there are dedicated areas that were remote and will continue to be so. It can happen in many situations. Remote communities can live in suburbs, in small cities, as well as in country. So this kind of hollow spaces with fewer services, fewer mobility solutions, is a kind of situation that is not from all the past and will continue during all the future. You can have a dynamic area becoming more and more isolated because some public or private services move anywhere else because they want so to spend some real estate costs or transportation costs. So we must keep this in mind, not to think we won't have to adapt our answer. So the first thing from an operator point of view, isolated communities are difficult to reach, not because it is a technical question, but because the economic model to reach their needs is seldom consistent. So the first thing for us is to consider not these communities as an isolated object, but as part, maybe, of a wider territory with more developed areas, less developed areas, and some relations between the two. Historically, every mobility solution grew from a developed area because every mobility solution requires infrastructures. You need roads, you need energy networks, you need safe place to land, whether you have a plane or drones. And to have these kind of infrastructures, you need a long-term vision. You need a governance with stable vision of the planning, urban planning, and a capacity to allocate some resources, some financial resources to this. So for us, this problem of economic model as a double-sided, refers to a double-sided issue. One is the governance, the other side is the funding. And we try not to be in the situation to sell some products from a shopping list. You know, would you like metros? Would you like drones? It's not the right approach, according to us. We try to bring solutions meeting the very needs of the territories and to have creative solution and not standardized solution. You can mix regular lines of transport with on-demand services. You can have some scholar lines becoming at certain hours of the day, the lines in central part of the cities or everywhere else. And you should also keep in mind to finance this kind of service or this kind of infrastructures that the transport, the mobility has a benefit that exceeds hugely the simple questions of mobility. This is the reason why, for example, this project in Paris, the Greater Paris Express, was financed through a sort of fiscal technique of capturing land value to come because of the mobility solutions. So it's a way to think, well, these questions of mobilities are very open questions. They need a vision that could be more integrated, more holistic. And in this kind of frame, operator can have creative solutions. But we don't have one product to meet one problem. We must say, wait, what's the global situation? What's the environment? What will be the demand tomorrow? And then we can begin to think of our possibilities and the kind of solutions we could offer.
Thank you. Timothy.
Well, today's ministerial declaration talked about the need to promote an intermodal systems approach to transport planning. And I'd like to talk briefly about an emerging mode of transportation that was occasionally mentioned during some of the sessions at ITF, but hasn't really been directly addressed, which are drones and new forms of aviation. And one of the things that I love about working on drones is it's really a technology that has the potential to connect disconnected communities. And probably the most famous example of this is in Rwanda, where they're using drone delivery to bring blood supplies to remote rural clinics. And I had the opportunity to talk to some of the government officials who are implementing this and ask them, why do you think Rwanda was the place where this started? And they talked about the fact that they'd obviously had a social crisis back in the 90s. And they said, we just had to make a decision to all be part of the same society again. And these kinds of connectivities were part of realizing that vision. Another example that people may be less familiar with, but given that we are being partially hosted here by the Government of Canada, I thought I'd bring a Canadian example, is the First Nation people of the Moose Cree community signed an agreement with Drone Delivery Canada to bring supplies via drone to a remote island community called Moose Factory. And this is an area that, especially during certain times of year when the water isn't navigable, experiences very high food prices. And now they have a new mode of connecting with the mainland and getting access to those kinds of goods that they need. Now, I think where this is all going is actually towards the movement of people. So what's colloquially known as flying cars or people carrying drones. And we actually see the government of Japan taking a very proactive approach on this. Their Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, in partnership with the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transportation, has produced something called the Roadmap for the Aerial Mobility Revolution. And they are looking at, in the mid-2020s, using flying cars to provide connectivity to these rural communities where rail service and bus service are no longer economical, because as many people are aware, they're experiencing a declining population overall, but especially in rural areas, while the age is increasing. And those people are not likely to move and would find it very challenging to change context. So they're looking at how these kinds of flying cars can replace that service. And in some ways, it's perfect because it has low fixed costs, and actually the private sector could bear a lot of the costs, and you can cover a lot of areas. And I actually think this could be perfect in a context like what the minister from Chile was speaking about, where you have a lot of these communities that only have a few people, and it's very expensive to provide this kind of service. Now, in some ways, Japan is an extreme case of this, but I think they also may be ahead of the curve for a lot of communities. We see many countries that are falling below replacement rate in terms of demography, and they're going to be seeing a similar trend where the rural areas are increasingly old with a declining population. So there's really an opportunity to provide these new forms of aerial mobility as a increasingly important solution to servicing these communities. And I think I'll pause there.
And that's a nice segue to Yohei.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm personally very interested in the air mobility, air taxi. But first, I'd like to introduce a new land transportation utilizing new technology, on-demand transit, on-demand bus services. In Japan, in rural area and low density area in Japan, demand responsive transport, DRT in short, or on-demand bus or shared ride taxi, is operated as local public transportation for more than 2 decades. As DRT, door-to-door service provided while picking up 2 or more passengers, like buses. To calculate the effective route to pick up the passengers, route calculation system is usually used, and many IT companies in Japan and all over the world have developed the efficient system, efficient algorithm to dispatch the vehicle and calculate the route. And actually, some Japanese companies have providing the system more than 10 years. And the local governments usually decide the service plans, such as the service area and price. And the private companies, private bus operators and taxi operators operate the actual service. The service is usually provided under affordable price, really low price compared to the normal taxi, and most of expense is covered by government, local government. So the service works very well to provide means of transportation to those who don't own the driving license. However, the service is not so widely used by young people and active elderly people who can own the car and drive the car. And the problem is that the elderly people in Japan continues to own and drive their private car even after they get old and feel unsafe to drive. And the accident by elderly driver is now one of the most serious problem in road safety in Japan. So in order to make them happily give up their own private car, we need to provide a better mobility service. And we need to provide a freedom of mobility, which is close to the freedom of private car. So the current DRT on-demand bus service in Japan is not so actually flexible because of the constraints of the budget of local government, and in many cases, the booking in advance is required. So we had to plan the trip beforehand, and it's not so free compared to the private car. However, in many IT routing system, in routing algorithm, we can calculate more large-scale problem with more large number of vehicles and large number of passengers. And with these systems, we can provide more convenient and flexible services, which is close to the freedom of car. So with algorithm and pricing and big deployment policy, I believe that DRTs have potential to provide freedom of mobility, and that can improve road safety by making elderly people and people who feel unsafe to drive happily give up their own car and proudly shifting to mobility services. And in the near future, I believe that air mobility, air taxi, and autonomous shuttle services will join the on-demand service options, and that will accelerate the shift from the private car to the mobility services, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Interesting outlines there for the future. So you talked about creativity.
Yeah.
Now, to me, that seems that you've got a natural overlap there with Tim, because he's given you tremendous technology. How could you use that?
Well, you know, I'm very interested in the example you've just developed, because we are all fascinated by technologies, and we tend to think it is the only place where innovation takes place. But there is much innovation in economic model, in organization of the services. And I think we should also consider that, you know, on-demand service is a very good method, for example, to address the hollow space between peak hours when you have buses with no passengers, and then you can divert their route to pick up some people in another place. So I think we don't have explored all the possibilities we have with existing technologies. I'm not saying that it's not interesting to explore new ways of flying, and so we just signed a partnership of memorandum of understanding with Airbus to approach flying taxis. So of course we're interested in. But we have also this experience of various territories where it's not a problem of technology. It's really a problem, what's your vision about people? What's your vision about partnership? There's another example in Japan I was fascinated by, in the suburbs of Kyoto, the Daigo community bus, where the service is financed by partner companies and not through fares. And I think there's a lot of space to imagine new approaches in the mobility.
Okay, so it's the business models. Flying cars are great, but at this moment in time, it's not the be-all and end-all.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think it should be considered as one mode of transportation. And something that I think is very interesting about it is I absolutely agree with you, sort of the challenges are around the economic modeling. And do these new forms of aviation allow for a new kind of economics around this, where distance is considered differently, right? I mean, for most of the terrestrial modes of transportation, there's a significant increase as you increase distance, especially you have to invest in upgrading the roads. But for aerial mobility, there isn't that sort of same economic model. And just one thing I'd like to add is that there was an interesting paper recently in the journal Nature that demonstrated from a physics-based model that there's actually lower CO2 emissions from a flying car than even from an electric vehicle at over 100 kilometers. So the theme of this ITF summit is around regional connectivity. And while these kinds of flying cars have been talked about often in terms of urban aerial mobility, which is sort of how Uber frames it, in fact, they're even better for these middle distance, between 50 to 200 kilometer leaps that are now being handled through other mechanisms. And hopefully we'll see more consideration of that in future summits.
I'm sure we will. And I mean, when you talk about the new business model, in your case, Yohei, it's what complicates it is Japan's demographic balance, the tilt more towards the elderly, and also incorporating them so that they don't feel somehow left behind in the transport revolution.
So you mean the demographic balance?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. The tilt between the imbalance, if you like, the young to the old to the young. Yeah, in part of that economic structure, the new economy that we were just referring to. You can't rule that out, the demographics.
Yeah, actually, the elderly people is really, the number of elderly people in Japan is really increasing. Mm. And the problem is that we can provide a more efficient service using the smartphone or IT-oriented services, but the problem is that the elderly people, most of the elderly people cannot use the smartphone applications or the dynamic on-demand route services. So some companies provide telephone-based services or taxi button just like Amazon dash button. And there the people just push the button and the taxi or on-demand taxi comes. So yeah, of course we need the state-of-art technologies, but also we need more user-friendly, user-side technologies, including the service design for elderly people, and of course the service design for family and the local community. And I'm so happy and I'm amazed that you know the case of Kyoto Daigo community. Actually, the local company and local shops provide a subsidy, and they are the sponsors of the bus services there. And yeah, I think that actually the shopping center have usually provide free parking, and I think that means the shopping center is a sponsor of car usership, because they provide free parking that otherwise utilized and monetized by using for other purpose. So it's my idea is to provide free bus services or discounted bus services to the shopping center instead of providing a huge the parking area.
Yeah, getting people out of their cars, basically, breaking that connection.
Yeah.
And I know you wanted to respond as well, the idea of getting older people to use the new technology.
I was thinking, you know, RTP is an engineer company, so sometimes we tend to think, well, the world would be much easier if we hadn't passengers blocking the doors and making everything late. But the reality is that if we don't go back to people, you will just fail. And I think we must consider who will be partner in this mobility vision. How will we build together something meaningful? And when you consider this broader vision, you can have another kind of evaluation, another kind of financing options, and then solutions are much easier. If you just have technology objects and financing needs, you won't have any invisible hand making the meeting smooth. You must think different.
Tim, I thought you wanted to respond to that.
I was just very much agreeing, and that goes for even the most cutting-edge solutions. If you don't start with what are the needs of the people and design around that,
it's
they'll fail.
Talking to communities effectively, which is the point that we raised in the first discussion.
Exactly. So there needs to be community engagement from the beginning.
Okay, and on the subject of talking, we're going to open up the floor so you guys can talk to us. So who wants to join our cherished circle? The door is open. Please come forward. And if you can just introduce yourself and the organisation or publication you represent.
Okay. Hello. So I'm Jenny Eckhart from VTT Technical Research Center, Finland, and I've been researching rural mobility for some years in some projects. And so what we have found, like you said also, that on-demand services are good solutions for rural areas, but what we also need there are sharing services. So, for example, this kind of ride-sharing and peer-to-peer car sharing services, and also ride sharing for goods. So we need a lot of different kind of new services, and also what we need to do is combine transport of freight and people, so that we can put all possible different transport flows what we have as much together as we can. And also the transport of different user groups. For example, we have now ongoing a project where we are piloting that statutory social and healthcare transport that are strongly subsidized. They will be integrated, so not separately social transport services and healthcare. So they will, for example, for elderly handicapped people, so they will be combined as much as possible. And like said, maybe mobile application is not the best option for them, so they still have a possibility to call the ride, but those transportations will be opened for private people using a mobile app. So in that way, when we are combining different user groups, public sector will have a reduced cost, so they will have more efficient services. And then in those areas where no public transport exists because there are not enough people, we will be able to provide them services because they can have access to these statutory services, what we are having now. And yeah, and then like said that we need, like we are combining different kind of user groups and services, we need to have public-private partnership, and that we are like testing here, but also in the future we have to have the fourth P, so public-private people partnership, because we need to integrate these kind of services, like the private people, they are also prosumers, so they produce and they consume services like this kind of ride sharing and these peer-to-peer rental services.
So integrated services, and in terms of the backers, the public and private partnerships, one big holistic join.
Yes,
okay, there's a lot there.
Yeah, that's the aim, but we are piloting these public-private
Yeah, well, let's get the reaction
services.
to this. I saw you scribbling away furiously there, Elena.
Of course, I think combination is the real innovation. We were convinced metro will rule the world, but of course it's not the case. So I think we must have this all solutions combined, and the right combination in each case, which will be different anyway. So we try in France to have this vision combining car sharing, bikes, buses. If you look at our app, RETP, you can, on a certain area, visualize the next buses, the next station with e-bikes or so on, the next metros with the intervals and duration and so on. So we know people will choose what they want according to their needs, according to their preference, and we must not prescript their choice. We must offer this choice, and we try to have a set of solutions and not only one way.
So can I have your response to that, Yohi? Basically, she's talking about having greater integration, a more holistic approach.
Yeah, actually, I'm developing. We are developing mobility as a service mass applications that integrate all mobility services in the city, and we are mainly operating the service in Tokyo area. So the public transportation plays a very important role, but now we are discussing with local government and local public or private transportation company. I found that yeah, as you'd say that there are many huge variation of the combination of the services and the combination of who provide the services in the large high density area like Tokyo. There are many taxi and bus companies, private sector companies. So where private sector can, or as a company can provide services like bus or shared taxi. But in the rural area, there's no bus or taxi company in some areas. So we have to utilize the local community and ride sharing services. So, and also the freight and passenger services together. So yeah, I'm really, I agree that yeah, the variation is, there are many variations of the integration of transportation.
Just something that sort of keeps coming up in all these discussions is the cost difference in providing services to rural areas versus urban areas. And we've been working a bit with the e-commerce company in China, JD.com, that talked about how the reason they got involved in drones is they observed that the cost of delivering goods to rural areas was 5 times that of delivering the same good in urban areas. And, you know, as you said, it's really about the economic models here. And I think it'll be interesting to see if new forms of aerial mobility can reduce that cost difference between rural and urban. And just as a side note, Finland will soon be piloting drone delivery with Google spin-off Project Wing, so maybe it'll be integrated in some of those issues that you're talking about.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. So I hope that we will be also implementing those in rural areas and try them there.
And the reporting on your findings.
Yes, yes. I will be reporting in English also later this year.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to that. And is there anybody else who would like to put a question to the panel, or perhaps respond to this lady's her report on what she's doing? Is anybody? Come again. Come and join us. Oh, go on, bring a chair. You might as well. The circle's expanding. That's what I like to see. Can we have a microphone? Oh, you've got one. Excellent.
Thank you very much. Sorry, me again. I want to very strongly emphasize what we just heard also from Yohei-san. We've been talking a lot about fixing problems that we see emerge, that we have emerging, like demographics, rural exodus, and other things. But what I'd like to propose is that also if we talk about accessing the regional space, we need to develop a vision for the future. And there, I think the railway is still one of the strongest tools that we have. I grew up in rural France. When I was 10 years old, I was standing at the rail station in my village, and the music of the village was playing, the brass music. And I was asking my father when I was a kid, "Daddy, why is the music playing?" And my father said, "Look at the train, look very well at it. It's the last time you'll see it." It was when they closed down the line. It was the last run. And it was one of the worst things that happened in my life. You know, from then on, I had to be driven. I would, a 10-year-old kid. You know, French roads very dangerous, even by bike, so etc. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. A railway presents a corridor of development. It's a presenter, if you do it in the right way, a preventer of urban sprawl, a preventer of negative externalities and of gross unsustainabilities, if you do it right. And that means absolutely in the future, blending it with on-demand services that are orthogonal to it, and that using those new technologies totally, including aerial things, you know, even if there's no demand in the Swiss Alps, we have cable cars and going up to the mountains, but when the demand is not there, or when it's cheaper to build, why not use kind of these flying taxis to provide services or supplement them in peak hours or everything. So I would very strongly advocate for what you just say, to create something that you might call mobility as a service, you might call it otherwise, but at the end of the day, it's making the best of existing and new technologies, leveraging them, leveraging what we have, and not disrupting. I'm sick of this word disruption, actually. We shouldn't disrupt something that's okay. We should disrupt what's really not working and innovate where we really need progress. And so I could only very strongly second that, and want to see that by creating corridors that very often, I mean, we know this from hundreds of stories of acceptability, even in North America, rails attract people, even coaches on a road, so-so, right? So let's have that dynamic and assign every mode where it belongs to. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Thank you.
Music to your ears.
Of course, we have a French word to describe what you are. We call it ferrovipat, you know, so someone's so profoundly passionate with railways. so we love this kind of people. Yeah, I agree. A railway are a corridor of development, and our point of view, we use them as backbone of a network's vision of mobility. For example, we open an automatic metro in Doha, and we also have some feeding buses networks, because you can't have magical eruption of people in your metro networks. You must have them access to this. So how do they do between the access and their home? So this phenomenon of the last miles must be taken into account if you want to have a network that would be efficient. And I also agree with the fact that we must leverage what we have. And this is why I said I think we do not have explored all the possibilities of combining the existing technologies. And this is the place for some of creativity.
So you guys are going to be talking a lot, really, aren't you? Oh, did you want to respond?
It's a very nice example that you're citing Doha. I actually happened to make the micro-mobility plan for the medical campus in Doha and around the metro station. And yes, even in Doha, Qatar, bikeability and walkability, if you provide shaded walkways, if you learn the West from Singapore, from Europe, from America, you put it together, it works, it gets accepted, and it went through.
Okay, So I could comment that I also like railways. So I think it would be a good way to build travel chains using a railway as it's an environmental friendly way to travel, and then combine with these additional services. For example, what I was telling, but the fact is, for example, at least in Lapland in Finland, you might have some hundreds of kilometers to the nearest railway station. So then again, it's not so relevant in every place. But I like railways.
Are you feeling a bit marginalised here, Timothy?
Not at all. I was just thinking, I've been reading about the next generation of high-speed trains in Japan, and I just can't wait to go, 250 miles per hour on the new trunk line that's being developed. So I love railways too. I feel included.
I love railways too. So. Yeah. It's a big loving for the railways. Who else would like to join our circle? I mean, it's not a pleasure, an absolute pleasure. You may dislike, please. You may dislike railways. You might favour something else. Please feel free to join the circle in the time that we have left. I think they've all gone silent because they all love railways. They all love railways, and that's good. It's nice to see that the railways are being rehabilitated. It started with the railways. Let's keep them. It's the continuity of history. But yes, we've now reached the end of our session. So I would like to thank all of our guests, the panel members behind us. Thank you so much for your contribution. Let me remind you who they are. We have Gloria Hutt. She is the Minister for Transport and Telecommunications for Chile. Thank you so much. Ophelia Betancourt, Professor of Applied Economics, University of Las Palmas de Gran Canaria, Spain. And of course, Helen Hughes, Director of Professional Services, Transport Infrastructure, Ireland. Thank you so much for your contribution to that first panel. Thank you. And for the train and drone and anorak enthusiasts amongst you, Eleanor Lacroix, Director, Department for General Studies, Development and Territories, RATP France. Thank you. Timothy Reuter, Head of Drones and Tomorrow's Airspace at the Centre for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the World Economic Forum. Thank you. Hopefully the next time you appear, you'll bring one of your drones with you.
It'll be buzzing around this way.
Just as a side effect, what's the biggest drone you've created to date?
I actually used to run a company that created something called the pocket drone. So I've been focused on miniaturization in the past, but I'm excited for the people carrying drones.
So they're getting bigger and bigger. And Yohei Fujikaki, Senior Service Designer, Next Generation Mobility Team Management Strategy Department, Odakyo Electric Railway Company. Thank you so much for joining us. And can I also thank our audience, fantastic contribution, food for thought, and good luck to Canada as well, because you've got your big event in September. Yes. Can we have a microphone? Can we have a microphone so that you can just remind us a little bit more about that event?
Okay. Myself about that.
This is your round table.
Yes, it is a round table on connectivity of small populations in remote communities. It will be held in Ottawa on September 23rd and 24th. There is no snow in Ottawa in September. It'll be lovely. We look forward to welcoming international, academic, and policy experts from across the International Transport Forum membership to facilitate discussion and gather the latest research on remote connectivity. And I'm sure that today's discussion will provide valuable input to that roundtable as well. So thank you all very much for that.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.